Thank you for choosing to view this video about inculcating dispositions that are useful in workplace settings in turbulent, uncertain times. I'm Chris Dede. I'm a senior research fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where for 22 years I held an endowed chair as a professor in learning technologies. For many of those years, one of the courses that I taught was about motivation and learning. And the four pillars of motivation that were discussed in that course were engagement, self-regulation, beliefs, and dispositions. So dispositions are a very important part of understanding motivation and learning. And I'm happy that Ashley and I are going to share ideas with you.
And hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Etemadi. I am a co-founder and managing partner at Motiva Education. And I actually met Chris through the Next Level Lab, where we started doing research together. One of our topics of interest were dispositions. So we've been looking at this topic since 2020 in the pandemic. And so you'll see some examples that come through from the pandemic as well.
So we're going to talk about what are dispositions, because often dispositions are not defined well, and as a result, the literature is confusing. We'll give some examples so that we're grounding the general statements about dispositions in specific examples that relate to workplace. And then later, we'll talk about how one can build a disposition or change a disposition in an individual. And finally, about the challenges in terms of assessing and evaluating dispositions. So dispositions are not skills, but they are related to skills. In education, we focus on the knowledge and skills that students develop, and rightly so. But sometimes students graduate and they get really high grades and they clearly know everything that was covered. But when they get into life and the workplace, they don't apply those skills and that knowledge very well. And that's because to apply a skill, you need a disposition, a tendency that helps you understand when to use that skill and why you are using that skill. As a specific example, resilience is an illustrative disposition. Resilience is the ability to persist in the face of challenges and to bounce back from adversity. And you can tell why we're talking about turbulent and uncertain times, because those in particular, like the pandemic, like many of the challenges that people face at this moment, those times demand considerable resilience in terms of all the challenges that are involved. And we know something about people's characteristics who have resilience as a disposition, that is, who have a tendency to persist despite adversity. Those people typically are optimistic, so they don't see that fate has condemned them to end up in an unfortunate position. They believe that they can change what's happening in their lives. They're committed. They're focused in terms of what they want to accomplish, and typically they're connected. They have a strong support system. And you can see some of this in the pandemic, where some people who had similar knowledge and skills ended up behaving in very different ways. Some people were paralyzed by the pandemic because the command and control system of management collapsed, and no one was telling them what to do or how to do it in a new kind of situation. But other people were empowered by the chaos and the uncertainty from the pandemic, and they took charge of their own role and found ways to accomplish it, sometimes better ways than what they were doing before. So having resilience was really important in terms of that. I also would note that resilience and other dispositions can be different in different parts of a person's life. You can imagine a person who has a lot of professional resilience because they're optimistic about their profession, they're committed to what that those objectives are, and they're connected by a strong support system in their organization. But in their personal life, they might not be very resilient. They might have faced a series of personal challenges that led to their not being optimistic. They may not be certain what they really want in their personal life or have a good personal social support system. So dispositions are not universal. They're, to some extent, they're contextual in terms of what happens. But the importance of dispositions is borne out, like resilience, in a lot of entertainment. We see these are just a few of many recent movies where the central message was really to persist despite challenges, to not let the world beat you down, but to find ways to succeed no matter what. And that emphasizes not just the knowledge and skills, but having that vital disposition that separates the hero from other people with similar knowledge and skills who are just paralyzed by the situation they find themselves in.
These movies that we see, so Harry Potter, Mission Impossible, these movies often seem very fantastical and, not embedded in our reality. And so what does resilience look like in real life, in our day-to-day lives? So this example actually comes from a personal story in my own life where I was taking a course on programming, and it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. It started in March, and it had been a week or two before the course was scheduled to begin. Everything got shut down and everything went remote. So, for the interest of this presentation, the name of the programming coach has been changed to Alfonso, but this scenario is real nonetheless. So, Alfonso was a programming coach at the school and had, for his entire career, worked in person with students. And so, when the school was shut down and all the students had to start working remotely, that required a completely new skill set. Two examples that I want to highlight here is Alfonso, there was a coaching in person that Alfonso would manage. And so students would go to a physical space and they would kind of teach each other the concepts, the programming concepts. And then Alfonso would oversee this. But during the pandemic, when everything was shut down, it was either, get rid of that service altogether or think about creative ways to replicate that. And so Alfonso was very creative and demonstrated creativity in other areas of his work as well, but specifically during the pandemic, went above and beyond to actually create a virtual algorithm club that helps students train virtually. And then the second example that I wanted to mention is when one of the lead instructors resigned, Alfonso, instead of being demotivated and waiting for the school to hire another lead instructor, actually took up the responsibilities of the instructor for his cohort, even though he had been hired as just a coach. And we'll talk about more later on what the dispositions in those examples are. But some of them that come to mind are resilience, creativity, coming up with different ideas, being self-led, etc. Dispositions, we talk about them a lot in the education space, but unfortunately in workforce capacity building, the focus tends to be more on skills. Teach the student how to program, they're going to be great once they're on the job. The ability to perform a certain task or a certain skill revolves around also having the disposition, even though it's not part of that training. To be effective, you need not only the skill, but also the disposition to manifest that skill. And we see that a lot where people know how to be creative, but then once the situation arises for them to be creative, they don't know how to act upon that creativity. Later on in this presentation, we'll talk about how dispositions can both be helpful and unhelpful. And so we talk about resilience, But on the other end, there are dispositions that are unhelpful or negative. So, for example, selfishness. So, that could be a disposition where a person it has a tendency towards putting themselves before others in the workplace. And so we'll delve into that deeper. Going off of the idea of dispositions and dispositions being a tendency to act upon the skills that you have, here's a framework that talks about four components that dispositions encompass. So the first one being the skills. Of course, we mentioned that earlier. You need the skill of conflict resolution or creativity. You also need to be sensitive to situations. And sensitivity is basically the probability that you will notice a situation where a disposition or that skill will be valuable. Then the third component is inclination. You have the intention of using that disposition. So someone could go through a course on conflict resolution and have all of the skills and know when to notice the situations where conflict resolution would be valuable, but then does not have the intent of using those skills and resolving conflict. And the last one is appraisal. So this is an area that was actually with the input of Eileen McGivney at Northeastern. We added this component, and this is the understanding of the degree to which a disposition is useful in a particular scenario. And we'll talk about that later on as well. And then how are dispositions different from abilities in terms of kind of what happens in the workforce? So in the workforce, there's a lot of focus on the building of capacities to perform a task. The idea is that if you do enough training and you develop this ability, then it will shine through in the workplace. And abilities can remain unexpressed though. So you might have the ability to be creative, but you might be in a scenario that, does not bring out that creativity. You might be in an environment that does not encourage those abilities. And then last on abilities is they're very episodic, meaning they can come and go quickly. So I love to give the example of learning a new language. If you learn a new language and you don't practice it, then you quickly lose the vocabulary. Now, what's interesting is you might go back into a context where you need that language and redevelop those skills, or you might draw upon, words you might have forgotten or thought you had forgotten consciously, but subconsciously you still remember them. But the idea is that it can come and go. Dispositions, on the other hand, are how the abilities are manifested. So, as Chris mentioned, their tendencies, what happens when the opportunity arises. And unlike abilities where they can remain unexpressed, in order for it to be a disposition, it must be displayed in an actual situation. So, you might have an ability, but not necessarily the disposition, and therefore it doesn't get displayed when the situation actually calls for it. And I really like mentioning actually the triggering, obstructing, enhancing, and hindering of dispositions by environmental factors. So, for example, folks will mention, we want our people to be very creative, but then in the work environment, it's 95% or 100% procedural, where and any creativity might be squashed in the interest of operations, procedures, and efficiency, in which case, that environment is not conducive to the disposition of creativity being expressed. And then lastly, dispositions are non-episodic, meaning they take a long time to practice and develop. But once they are developed and they are practiced, it's very hard for them to disappear from one scenario to another, especially if the four components of dispositions are trained. Chris, I want to pause here and open it up. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts.
I think that you've done a great job of describing this. I think that often, because people are focused on abilities rather than dispositions, they ignore some of the things that really can undercut abilities, and the environmental factors can undercut abilities. The fact that if somebody has a tendency not to use an ability, often people don't challenge them on that, undercuts efficiency in the workplace and so on.
Yeah, and I think another one to point out here is that a lot of trainings, give someone all of the skills, but then don't necessarily tell them or show them applicable scenarios where they might use them, in which case that is also not very helpful in making that transition between having an ability and then being able to execute it in the workplace. And so a lot of the assumptions are, oh, this person, didn't learn it well. But rather they might know everything that they has to do with that topic, but rather they don't know the right situations where they should bring up those skills.
This gets into another construct called transfer that's very important in bridging the gap between education and the workplace. So if you follow on more deeply into dispositions, transfer becomes an important and interesting issue. So sometimes people get confused when you talk about dispositions and they map those onto soft skills. So they say, well, selfishness is negative, and that's a soft skill to be empathetic. And so dispositions really are different than soft skills. But there is quite a difference, because people may have good skills in terms of working well with others, but their dispositions can undercut the value of some of those skills. So you may think that you're good at collaboration, but if you only collaborate well with people you personally like, then the disposition undercuts the skill. If you only are fair when you're neutral about the conflict, if you only are focused on ideas where you have a personal stake in how those are applied, and so on. So it's important, again, not to just say if you get along with other people well, then you have the appropriate dispositions. The dispositions are more complicated than that, and they're very situational in terms of when they manifest and when they don't manifest. So Ashley and I decided it would be fun to just sort of collectively brainstorm both unhelpful dispositions we've seen in the workplace and helpful dispositions that we've seen. And I'll start with some of my unhelpful ones that I have seen. I've seen colleagues who were in denial. They have a tendency to refuse to admit problems when they exist. I've seen colleagues that are rigid. They're unwilling to change current practices and policies. Their tendency is to want things to stay the same. Sometimes people are petty. They tend to focus on small, unimportant details rather than the really big, important shifts that are occurring. People can be paranoid. I don't mean in the clinical sense, but in the more general, informal use of the term, where a shift in behavior that they're asked to do is seen as a personal attack rather than seen as a necessary response to changes in the context. And finally, an unhelpful disposition is to be untruthful. When someone takes a point of view and lies about evidence that supports the point of view in order to push their point, that's definitely unhelpful in the long run in terms of what's going on. Ashley, do you have some unhelpful dispositions to add?
Yeah, I do. So in my work, I've seen a big one being where a organization has a tendency to, encourage arriving at a decision, but only once the full information is made available. And by full information, that could be, subjective, where that kind of leads to hesitance to coming at a decision. Another one is where I've seen a tendency towards generating great ideas, but then erring on the side of inaction. So a disposition towards being non-committal or to being indecisive. And then a third one that I've seen is a disposition towards being dismissive towards subordinates, where in a time of uncertainty, there's a tendency to communicate alignment to senior leaders, but not to other folks at the same level of oneself. Those are kind of three big ones that I've noticed.
What about helpful, Ashley? Do you have some examples of helpful you want to share?
Yeah, and then for helpful dispositions, I've seen the tendency to, be exploratory or be curious. So this is seeking out new data or information in light of changes. This age of generative AI has been a big one where I've seen some people exhibiting the tendency of exploring, seeking out new information in light of this new technology. Another one is a tendency towards problem solving and generating new ideas in dire situations. So a disposition towards being determined. And this was, I would say, exhibited by Alfonso at the school. And then a final one, which is kind of a play on the being dismissive towards peers, is a tendency towards communicating more often with senior leaders to ensure alignment when there's a lot of uncertainty or turbulence, which would be seen as a positive disposition, a disposition towards being communicative and wanting to be truthful and sharing information. And then, Chris, do you have any that would be helpful dispositions that you've seen in your work environment?
Well, one thing that you've mentioned earlier in the discussion, Ashley, is creativity. And certainly in turbulent and disruptive times, being able to propose novel ideas and actions is important. And coupled with creativity is being experimental, having a tendency to try alternative approaches to see what the consequences are, understanding that some of those alternative approaches are going to fail, but not feeling worried about the fact that they're going to fail, understanding that to reach the best outcome, you have to experiment, and not all the experiments will be successful. And then the concluding disposition that I really like to see in colleagues and where I can in myself is being responsible, just committing to achievement and saying the buck stops here. I don't care what the challenges are. I'm going to be responsible for making this happen. I think that that kind of disposition, especially in turbulent times, is really helpful. So we don't have the opportunity to pause and have you brainstorm at this point and then provide feedback on what you came up with, but you might consider, after you're done watching this video, coming back to the slides, taking a look at this one, and thinking about your own dispositions, useful and helpful, and sometimes less useful and less helpful. And also thinking about the context that you work in, the organization that you're part of, and what dispositions that organization supports and fosters, and what dispositions it undercuts. This is a good kind of reflection to engage in. So it doesn't make much sense to do anything about dispositions if they can't be changed. I mean, if they're just fixed, then we can be aware of them. But it's much more important to think about dispositions as something that can be inculcated or altered. Now, as we've said, when we compare dispositions to abilities, dispositions are less easy to change, but they can be shaped by different kinds of environmental factors, and they can be altered by different kinds of educational interventions. And this is an approach that has a long history connected with it. So if you look at the military across different countries, the military has ways of developing dispositions, particularly in the leadership of the military, where you're taught resilience and tenacity and mindfulness and self-confidence as part of being a leader under situations that can be pretty dire and pretty uncertain. Similarly, in the medical profession, once students who want to be doctors have finished their coursework, they don't go immediately into practice. They go through an internship and then a residency in a clinical setting. And a lot of that isn't simply building their skills and their knowledge, it's developing different kinds of dispositions. Those internships and residencies are deliberately made difficult, worse than what you would encounter in everyday practice, as a way of building these dispositions of resilience and tenacity, and then providing support and a social system that helps people to see those dispositions as positive and become self-confident in using them. So while it isn't easy to inculcate dispositions, it is possible and desirable.
So, how can dispositions be strengthened? There are a few important components to developing dispositions and strengthening them. The first one is situational awareness. So, as we mentioned earlier, learners need to know what the disposition looks like and feels like, and what are the situations in which it would be relevant to use that disposition. And then second is something called spontaneity in the framework, but it's essentially that learners can autonomously use that disposition without being prompted or reminded. So no one needs to tell you to, be creative when school gets shut down and, everything moves online. No one has to actively tell you to use a disposition. It comes naturally. This would be developed by putting learners in different types of scenarios and having them either act out what it would look like to be creative in a scenario or think of examples through a potential case study. Then third is reflection. So reflection is very important in terms of learners being able to think about how this disposition factors into their identity, how they might use it in the future, how they've used it in the current scenario, and why they used it, to understand their own thinking, being metacognitive about their own experiences using that disposition. The final one, and there's others that are in this framework, but these are definitely the most important, is intentionality. So knowing that the use of the disposition is conscious and proactive, intentional, so the individual knows that they're actually using this disposition. There are many examples that we could draw upon. I know Chris drew upon the military, and the military has done a lot of work in resilience training. And this is another example of resilience training that was developed by Virtually Better during the pandemic. And it was a VR scenario where healthcare workers would go in and practice being in emergency situations. Before we wrap up, we wanted to mention that having extended scenarios is extremely important for dispositions. So, as we mentioned earlier, dispositions need multiple opportunities for practice under varied circumstances. And the learner would probably need to see these skills displayed in different scenarios in order to be able to know when and how to call upon these skills when the scenario is relevant. On the right, you'll see a slide. In this specific scenario, we worked on a negotiation pilot, this idea of having a string of scenarios that allows learners to practice those skills under varied circumstances and exercise practicing calling upon those dispositions is very helpful. And Chris, I'll pause here. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Yes, Ashley, I agree that the extended aspect is particularly important. And often people don't recognize really what life experience is giving them, because when someone has a lot of life experience in an area like negotiation and they become a skilled negotiator, people say, oh, well, they must have been building their skill the entire time. Well, to some extent that's true, but maybe just as true is they've been building their disposition the entire time. The suite of dispositions that's needed to be a successful negotiator. And an expert may not be able to communicate everything they know to a novice, even if they communicate every skill, because they don't have a way of communicating a disposition. That's something that has to be developed individually.
Yeah, I think,
Next
Chris,
one.
we hear that often from folks, from learners who say that one, they have a tendency to not want to negotiate because it's scary to them, even if they do have the skills. And then second is recognizing the situations in which they should negotiate. They say, "Oh, I didn't realize that I could negotiate in that situation," or the terms of that agreement were negotiable. And so I think that is very important. And then the last component is appraisal. And I think Mike, in his book, The Art of Negotiation, talks about a few examples where people went too far in their negotiations and it actually ended up destroying the relationship between the two parties. And so it is a delicate balance and developing that disposition of, how, when, and how much to negotiate is important. Finally, in assessing dispositions or evaluating whether or not learners are walking away with the dispositions that we've been attempting to inculcate. So there's a variety of methods, and the list goes beyond what we've written here, but this is a sample of some of the work that's being done. And I'll talk to the first two with respect to peer assessment surveys. So this is something that's being developed by Jafar Tavakoli at Penn State University, specifically in computing education, where he is looking at the use of surveys during semester-long group work projects to assess dispositions of the group members. And he has created a survey instrument that's being tested at a variety of institutions across the United States. The second one is a work-based learning, or what might be considered apprenticeships. So there's a lot of work on this, specifically in the UK, at Germany, and in Europe at large, around apprenticeships as being a way to gauge whether or not learners are displaying some of the dispositions that would be valuable in those jobs. So, for example, persistence in a activity that might be considered difficult on the job. And then, Chris, I'll pass it off to you for simulation-based learning.
Yes, I do a lot of work with learning through simulations and games. And the important thing about dispositions is that ultimately they're assessed by behaviors. So you can ask somebody what their beliefs are and maybe get a pretty accurate response, but you can't really ask somebody what their dispositions are. You watch how they behave to find out what their dispositions are. And good simulations and good games for assessment elicit behaviors that then can be captured and assessed so that you can show somebody that they may feel that they are collaborative, but you can show them being collaborative in one way when they're working with someone from a male gender and collaborative in a different way when they're working with a female, and that there's a disposition there that's unfortunate that's getting in their way. So at the end of the day, the more behaviors can be assessed, they're a kind of ground truth in terms of dispositions. I want to return to where we started, that dispositions are very important in a time of high turbulence and uncertainty and disruption. In 2020, I co-edited a book that was about new models of lifelong learning. And we began the book with a rather pessimistic forecast. We said, the reason these new models are important is because we're entering a period of decades that are going to be difficult along multiple dimensions, parallel to what happened a century ago when a generation faced first the First World War, then a terrible pandemic after the war, then the Great Depression, then the Second World War, then the start of the Cold War, all within a single generation. We said we're living in a similar time now. Climate change, failure to reach any of the UN sustainability goals, and advances in technology that are disrupting the nature of the economy. Well, ironically, it turned out that we were too hesitant in that assessment of difficulties because the book was written before the pandemic. It was written before the rise of Gen AI and the turbulence that's caused in the workplace. And it was written before the rise of authoritarianism around the world and the ways in which that's disrupting globalization. So it underscores where we are in history, how important dispositions are in helping us to get past this point. Ashley?
To build on that, so I think that's very important. And then also our paper talks about in terms of, where the future of learning could go in light of dispositions being extremely important and turbulent times. I think that the way that higher education or learning has been structured and been progressing in the last few years might not really be helpful in turbulent times and as things change rapidly. And so, how might we restructure some of the workforce training that happens and add to some of the learning experiences that we do in higher ed in order to support learners for these rather unpredictable times? Our learning and teaching efforts need to be structured differently moving forward. We can't just be focusing on skills and assuming that things are going to manifest and play out as we did in the training environment. We have to really prepare people to be using these skills under circumstances that are going to look remarkably different than the circumstances under which they were trained.
So we thank you for watching this video. We've presented a big picture view of a very deep subject. And if either of us both of us can be helpful to you, we hope that you'll reach out to us because dispositions are really important.